So as a young kid, I actually grew up with a congenital heart problem, which means that I was born with a defect in my heart. Hey guys, Greg Chaplin here, physical therapist and strength and conditioning specialist. In this video, I want to discuss the relationship between health-related anxiety and chronic pain and symptoms. And the way that I'm going to do this is by breaking down what chronic pain is, talking a little bit about health-related anxiety, and then I'm going to give an example from my own experience of how this played a role for me and how recognizing this and learning to work with this actually helped me to overcome chronic pain and symptoms. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what chronic pain is. So chronic pain is really just any pain that lasts longer than expected. So you'll see this as described as longer than 3 months. But I'd like to think of this as pain or symptoms that last longer than you'd expect based on the natural course of healing for that particular injury. So when we're talking about acute or subacute type pain, usually there's a structural cause. When we're talking about chronic pain, we're typically talking about a non-structural generated pattern of pain. So this is termed neuroplastic pain, which describes that the brain and the nervous system have strengthened pain pathways, and we start to produce pain in a number of non-threatening type situations. So remember that pain is the way our body communicates threat to us, and in a chronic pain situation, we start to perceive threat where there is no threat. And so this is a process that's known as predictive coding, and it's much like what happens when you see something like an optical illusion. Based on all your previous experiences and what your brain sees in that moment, it produces a certain perception. And oftentimes we have sensations in the body, or we have certain exposures in terms of the stimuli from our environment. And a person without chronic pain might see that as non-threatening, but a person with chronic pain might actually perceive threat and thus produce pain. So this is actually where the health-related anxiety comes in. And to illustrate this, I'll share a story from my own life, and then I'm going to tie this all back together. So what is health-related anxiety? So health-related anxiety is a term that I'm using to include a broad spectrum of anxiety-related feelings towards one's health. So if you look in the research, you'll see these diagnostic type categories, and that's not really what I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about a diagnosed somatic symptom disorder, and I'm not talking about a diagnosed health illness anxiety disorder, formerly known as hypochondriasis. I'm not talking about these distinct diagnostic entities, but I'm talking about a spectrum where there's some sort of anxiety around your health, which is ultimately going to produce more fear and threat in the body. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this manifested for me, and then how this actually contributed to my chronic pain and symptoms. If you're finding value in this video so far, go ahead and like this video, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the channel. All these things help the algorithm to help me help more people. Okay, so to just share a little bit of a story here, this is something I don't talk about a lot because, quite frankly, it's pretty uncomfortable for me to even admit. But this was something that had been influencing my chronic pain and symptoms for a long time. And it actually took me a really long time to figure this out. But once I did figure this out and I started to process some of the feelings that were associated with it, I saw a huge reduction in those chronic pain and symptoms. So I think it's worth sharing. So as a young kid, I actually grew up with a congenital heart problem, which means that I was born with a defect in my heart. And so as I grew up, I experienced a number of symptoms like shortness of breath, poor aerobic capacity. I was underweight. I was poor in terms of the coloration of my face, and I was just growing a little bit slow. So there were a lot of symptoms there, but those symptoms got worse over time as the actual congenital heart defect started to limit my function more and more and more. And so this is something that is actually a very rare congenital heart defect. It's something that's usually picked up in the first, couple of months of life. But for me, because of the severity of the defect itself and some of the features of it, I was able to actually make it all the way until about 12 years old, until the symptoms became so significant that it was more clear. Now, what I want to also say is that I was experiencing these symptoms throughout my life, from the time I was born until I was 12, but they were just getting worse and worse. But I had always kind of perceived some bit of a difference between me and other people. So that's important for a little later in the story, but just worth noting. So then at 12 years old, I went to my pediatrician, who then referred me to a cardiologist based on hearing a heart murmur. When I went to the cardiologist, they did testing and they determined that I had this congenital heart defect that would require open heart surgery within a relatively short period of time. So it was only 3 months later, and I was having that open heart surgery. Luckily, I'm here up in Boston with some of the best heart surgeons in the world. And even though it was a rare condition, my heart surgeon had done a fair amount of those surgeries, and the surgery was relatively easy and it was successful. So after that surgery, I actually felt really, really good because I was getting a lot more oxygenated blood to my extremities. I put on a lot of weight. I got a lot more color in my face. I started actually going through a growth spurt after that. My aerobic capacity went up. I no longer had those episodes of shortness of breath when I was doing things like sports. And I felt like I was on a much more even playing ground with my peers in terms of physicality. Now, I mention this all because at the time, this was very much perceived as a positive situation. Right, I had a decrease in function prior to the surgery, then had found that something was wrong, had the surgery, and then had an increase in my function. So to me, it was almost like this was an opportunity for me to live the type of life and feel the way that other people had felt for those 12 years prior to that. So the way that I framed it in my mind at that time was that this was a positive experience, and I didn't perceive that I had any sort of anxiety around my health. Now, for the next 6 years, I'd stay nice and busy with middle school, high school, lots of music-related things. I went to college for music when one night I was on a gig and I had some sort of acute onset of symptoms that included left arm weakness. I actually lost consciousness for a brief moment. I felt an increased heart rate. I had an onset of what I know now to probably be a panic attack at the time. And all these symptoms came on all at once. And at that moment, it really activated this anxiety about my health that I didn't know that I really had. And so in the months and weeks following that, I'd constantly be checking on my physical sensations in my body. If I was feeling some sort of chest-related discomfort or sensations in my rib cage, I'd be checking on that, worrying that there was something serious going on. Same thing went for my arm. I started to experience a lot of weird symptoms like migraine, ear fullness, and a lot of these other tension-related issues, and potentially issues that did involve some real structural damage that might have been done or structural injury. But this kept on going over time after all that had likely healed up. So as I went through treatment for this, I went to many specialists to look at different symptoms that were going on and get treatments that were geared towards those symptoms. And I really didn't have much success with a lot of those treatments, which is what led me ultimately to become a personal trainer and later a physical therapist, kind of in this search to figure out what's going on and to fix things. And so even after I got my doctorate in PT, I was still experiencing a lot of symptoms, and I was quite depressed because I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I'd actually gone to the length of actually getting my doctoral degree in this and totally changing my whole life trajectory in order to try to alleviate the suffering that I was experiencing with these chronic physical pain and symptoms. So then everything kind of turned around when I got so desperate that I finally started to do some meditation on a regular basis. And ultimately, I started to meditate pretty intensively to the point where I was doing, let's say, 40 minutes a day or 60 minutes a day, and doing multiple sessions of meditation a day. And what I ultimately realized through this process of meditation was that I was in a chronic state of anxiety and hypervigilance around my health. And I was always thinking about what was going on with my body. And not only was I thinking about what was going on with my body, but I was thinking about it in a very threatened way. And I experienced this state of threat about my body as being one in the same with my experience. And it wasn't until I got into meditation and I learned how to deconstruct that experience into its constituent elements that I began to see this more clearly. Now, as I started to do more meditation and get into expressive writing, what I started to realize is that those early experiences of having something wrong and not having it diagnosed and then having it suddenly diagnosed gave me this distrust of the medical system and also gave me this deep fear that something could be wrong with my body without someone knowing it. And so much later in life, when I started to manifest some of these symptoms, I was already on high alert and I had been primed to protect myself to an extent where it became maladaptive instead of adaptive. And this is very common when we're talking about chronic pain and chronic symptoms. So even though ultimately it was things like movement and meditation and regulating my nervous system that helped me build enough capacity to heal, the important thing that happened in this chain of events was realizing that there was a basis in my past, there was an experiential basis for how my nervous system was responding. And once I worked through that and started to process that, what I found is a very significant drop in my physical symptoms pretty much right away. And so this really revealed to me that that health anxiety component, even though it wasn't likely what actually set this into motion or necessarily caused it, it was something that actually made it a lot worse and made it evolve from that acute, subacute kind of a situation to something where it really was that neuroplastic, predictive coding related chronic pain and chronic symptom type presentation. So I really think what I want you to take away from this video is that when we're talking about chronic pain and symptoms, we don't have to blame one or the other. So it doesn't have to be a physical cause or a non-physical cause, a mental cause like health-related anxiety. But we do need to be aware that these things can play a role and they can actually magnify what's going on. So we might have something that starts with a structural injury, but then we might have some underlying experiences that predispose us to anxiety about our health. That can be activated at that time. And then those two things can play together in a way that keeps us in this perpetual cycle of being stuck. Now, I think a great way out of this is to get into some sort of a contemplative practice like meditation that can help you examine your experience more directly. This often helps you separate the anxiety from the physical sensations themselves, which can be an insight that just frees you from that identification with being the one in pain or being one and the same with your pain. Now, hopefully this video helped you to see that there's this connection and that these two are not mutually exclusive. And if you have any experience with this or any questions, why don't you go down and leave them in the comments if you feel comfortable doing that. If you've made it all the way to this part of the video, thanks a lot. This was a very personal one for me to share. So until next time, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace.